Not everyone who walks away from a destructive relationship truly survives, because there are people who leave with their bodies intact but their souls remain in the shadow of someone else. You did not begin this story by loving a narcissist. You began it long before that, in a place where memories have faded but feelings have never disappeared. It was the feeling of listening more than speaking, of observing more than living for yourself, of sensing what others never said out loud. As a child, you learned to read the air in a room, to guess moods through sighs, to adjust yourself just to keep things peaceful. You did not call it a burden, you called it instinct. And slowly, that instinct became who you are. You grew up with a sensitivity that others did not understand. You could feel the smallest changes in tone, in eyes, in silence. You knew when someone was sad even when they were smiling. You knew when a room was tense even when no one spoke. That empathy made you the one others came to, the listener, the one who stayed, the one who endured. Not because you were weak, but because you believed that if you were kind enough, gentle enough, patient enough, everything would eventually be okay. You learned to love by making space for other people's emotions, and little by little, you became used to placing yourself last. It was within that structure that the narcissist entered your life. Not loudly, not violently, not in the way you once imagined evil would appear. They came in with light, with charm, with the feeling that finally someone saw you, needed you, valued you. With them, you felt special, you felt worthy, and deeper than that, you felt you had a role, a chosen role, a needed role, a role you had been waiting for a very long time, even if you had never named it. At first, everything felt like a dream designed just for you. They said the exact words that touched the deepest empty spaces inside you. They reflected back the image you had always longed to become, the one who truly understood them, the one who stayed, the one deep enough to reach their inner world. You did not know it was a mirror, and you did not know that by looking into it for too long, you would begin to forget your own true face. Gradually, small things began to change. Compliments became rarer, warmth became unpredictable, moments of closeness started to carry a vague unease you could not explain. You found yourself apologizing more often, even when you were not sure what you had done wrong. You began to wonder if you were too sensitive, if you misunderstood, if you were asking for too much, and each time you turned inward, adjusted yourself, made yourself smaller, trying to become more pleasant, quieter, more acceptable. You did not realize that while you were trying to keep this relationship from falling apart, something else was quietly collapsing. Your boundaries. Little by little, you took on emotions that were not yours. Sudden anger, unexpected shame, a constant sense of guilt floating in the background, as if you were always lacking something. You did not know that you were becoming a shelter for the things they could not face within themselves. You only knew that you were growing more tired, more empty, and more distant from who you once were. There were nights when you lay still in the dark, trying to remember who you were before this relationship began. But that memory faded like an old dream. You knew there was a time when you laughed differently, thought differently, felt differently. But now, everything revolved around keeping them stable, keeping them satisfied, keeping them from leaving, and beneath it all was a very ancient fear that if you were not good enough, if you did not stay, if you did not endure, you would be abandoned. What you were never told is that your sensitivity was not an invitation for destruction, but it became a doorway opened for someone who could not carry their own darkness. A narcissist does not come to destroy you from the beginning. They come to place their darkness into your hands, little by little, until you no longer have empty hands to hold yourself. And you, with all of your empathy, accepted it without knowing you were stepping into a journey without a map. The deepest part of this story is not found in what they did, but in what is beginning to form within you. Even if you have not realized it yet, even if you are still trapped, even if you believe you are only trying to love the right way. Because in the moment, you begin to doubt your own reality. In the moment, you feel as if you are disappearing. Another process has already been activated, a process that is quiet, without light, but irreversible. That is the moment when the story truly begins. Not a story about love, not a story about pain, but a story about a necessary collapse so that something else can be born. That disintegration does not happen in a clear moment. There is no explosion or specific marker you can point to and say that everything started here. It happens slowly, quietly, like a thin layer of fog settling over your awareness each day, until you can no longer tell which thoughts are yours and which are echoes of someone else inside your mind. You still wake up, still move through your routines, still smile and speak to the outside world. But inside, something has shifted off its original axis and you do not know how to name it. You begin carrying emotions with no clear source. There are mornings when you wake up feeling guilty even though nothing happened the day before. There are moments when you feel ashamed simply for wanting rest, wanting quiet, wanting to be yourself. You find yourself apologizing before anyone has accused you. You explain yourself before anyone has asked. And gradually, you become used to constantly justifying your existence, as if your presence alone were already a burden. The narcissist does not need to say that you are wrong. They only need to stay silent at the right moment, withdraw warmth at critical times, or look at you with unfamiliar eyes when you are hoping for connection. And that is enough. You begin to adjust yourself. You change the way you speak, the way you think, the way you feel. You ignore your intuition, because every time you trust it, you are made to feel too sensitive, too dramatic, too demanding. Your world slowly shrinks, revolving around keeping this relationship from collapsing, even though you are no longer sure what you are holding on to. There are moments when you feel as if you are living in a room full of mirrors. Each time you look to the narcissist for validation, you only see reflections of what they want you to see. When you try to name your pain, it is twisted, denied, and handed back to you in the form of doubt. You begin to wonder if you are imagining everything, if your memories are reliable, if your emotions are real, and in that process, you lose the most precious thing you once had, trust in your own perception. But the most dangerous thing is not the confusion. The most dangerous thing is the adaptation. You begin to grow used to tension. You grow used to constantly monitoring the other person's mood. You grow used to living in a state of waiting, hoping that if you just try a little harder, everything will return to how it was in the beginning. You call it love. You call it patience. You call it sacrifice. But deep inside, your body knows the truth. Your body is exhausted. Your intuition whispers. Your sleep becomes lighter. Anxiety appears without warning, and you do not understand why you feel increasingly empty, even though you have given more than ever before. There are rare moments, very brief ones, when you almost touch the truth. A look, a careless sentence, a chill running down your spine. But each time, you quickly push it away. Because if you admit what you are feeling, the entire structure you built to survive will collapse. And you are not ready for that. You still believe you can fix it. That if you understand them deeply enough, love them enough, that darkness will soften. You do not realize that you are standing in the middle of an unequal exchange, where your light is being used to cover someone else's emptiness. Gradually, you are not only carrying their emotions, but also the parts of their darkness they cannot face. You feel anger on their behalf, shame on their behalf, guilt on their behalf. You become a container for what they refuse to claim as their own. And because you have been familiar with this role since very early in life, you do not see it as abnormal. It is simply another version of what you have always done, keeping others stable, even if it costs you yourself. There are nights when everything is quiet, and you begin to ask a very dangerous question. If you disappeared, would anyone notice? Not because you want to leave, but because you no longer feel truly present. You are alive, but you no longer feel alive from the inside. You exist in this relationship like a shadow, a function, a role, and the most painful part is that you once believed this was the price of mature love. But it is precisely at that lowest point, when you feel as if you have almost nothing left to lose, that something else begins to move, very softly, very deeply. Not strength, not the determination to leave, but a quiet resistance of the soul. A part of you begins to grow tired of denying yourself. A part begins to suspect that perhaps the problem is not that you are not enough, but that you have given too much. And even if you do not yet dare to believe that thought, it has appeared, like a small crack in the wall you built to endure. You are still there, still in the relationship, still trying. But from that moment on, everything has changed, because once the soul begins to question, it will never return to its original sleep. And even if you do not yet know what awaits you ahead, even if you are still immersed in someone else's darkness, A deeper process has been activated, not to save this relationship, but to save you. The moment when everything begins to shift does not look like a decisive choice. It does not arrive as a strong declaration or a clear action. It comes as a fatigue so deep that you no longer have the strength to keep pretending that everything is fine. You are still there, still in that relationship, but an invisible distance begins to form between you and the role you have carried for too long. You no longer react as quickly as before. You grow quieter, not out of fear, but because you no longer have the energy to defend yourself against things that were never your fault. You begin to notice that certain conversations always end the same way. No matter how you explain, no matter how gentle you are, the result is still that you feel smaller. There are moments when you look directly into the other person's eyes and no longer see the connection that once made you stay. Only a cold emptiness looking straight through you, and for the first time, instead of trying to fill that emptiness, you let it exist. That refusal to fill it frightens you, but it is also where something more real begins to breathe. Perhaps right now, as you hear this, you feel your heart sink slightly. Perhaps you have stood exactly at that point before, where nothing has collapsed yet, but nothing can continue as it was. If these feelings feel familiar to you, you are not alone. There are many people listening and recognizing themselves in every beat of this story, and if you want, you can leave a few lines to share, not to be comforted, but as a way of acknowledging that this story has touched you. Sometimes, simply being named makes pain feel less alone. And if you wish to keep moving with this current, stay, because what is about to open is no longer only a story about endurance. From that point on, you begin to observe instead of react. You notice that every time you express a need, the space immediately grows heavy. Every time you ask a question, the answer is twisted so that you doubt yourself. You see more clearly how silence is used as punishment, how warmth is given and then withdrawn to keep you waiting. These things are no longer entirely unconscious. You still hurt, but the pain now comes with awareness. That awareness does not bring peace right away. On the contrary, it makes everything more uncomfortable. Because once you begin to see clearly, you cannot return to the innocence you once had. You can no longer believe that loving harder will fix everything. A part of you still wants to cling to the old hope, because hope, even fragile, feels gentler than raw truth. But another part can no longer endure betraying yourself every day. Your body begins to respond before your mind can understand. Your chest feels heavier during meetings. You breathe more deeply when you are alone. You feel lighter in moments when you do not have to guess someone else's mood. These signals are subtle, but they are consistent, as if an ancient system within you is trying to remind you that life was not designed to exist in constant contraction. You begin to remember parts of yourself that were forgotten, things that once made you feel alive, but were set aside because they didn't fit the rhythm of this relationship. You do not return to them yet, but the memory of them appears, like fragments from another life. That realization brings sadness, and also the understanding that a more whole version of you once existed inside, before everything became too complicated. One evening, or in some very ordinary moment, you suddenly understand that you have spent too much time trying to be seen, while never asking whether you were seeing yourself. That question does not accuse, it simply lingers. But it is enough to shake the foundation of what you once believed. And from there, a quiet shift takes place. You no longer place all your focus on where this relationship is going. You begin to ask where you are going if you continue like this. The narcissist senses that change, even if they cannot name it, not because you say anything, but because you no longer react as before. And this makes everything more tense. There are attempts to pull you back into the old role. There are promises, familiar gentle moments, like a warm wind passing through the place where you once took shelter. But this time, you clearly feel the exhaustion after the wind passes. You no longer want to return there, even though it was once the only place you knew. You have not left yet, but you are no longer fully staying. You are standing between two worlds, where the old is dissolving and the new has not yet taken shape. This is the most fragile stage because it has no clear form. No one around you notices. Perhaps you yourself have not dared to admit it, but deep beneath it all, a truth has begun to carve itself into you. You were not born to exist only in the shadow of someone else. And from that still point, where self-deception can no longer fully hold, the next journey begins to take shape. not through escape, but through an unavoidable facing, a confrontation with what has been swallowed for too long. And that is where the story will lead you deeper still, into the part where there is no turning back, even if you want to. There comes a time, difficult to pinpoint, when every effort to keep balance finally collapses, not because you decide to let go, but because your body and mind no longer have the capacity to keep holding themselves together. You no longer argue, no longer explain, and no longer hope that with just a little more patience, everything will be different. Instead, there is a strange emptiness, as if you have passed through an invisible door and stepped into a space that is no longer familiar. The relationship is still there, but you are no longer inside it in the same way. This disintegration does not feel like a shock, but like a long exhaustion that causes every layer of defense to fall away. You begin to feel as if you are living in a body that no longer responds to will. There are days when you wake up and tears come without knowing why, not tied to any specific event. There are nights when you cannot sleep, not from fear, but because your mind is filled with questions that were never allowed to exist. Questions about boundaries, about worth, about why love has always required you to disappear. In those quiet spaces, your inner world begins to speak in a very different way, no longer through clear thoughts, but through images, sensations, dreams. You dream of standing in a large room filled with light, yet with no exit. You dream of a brilliant feast where the food turns to ash in your mouth. You dream of familiar faces wearing masks, laughing and talking, while behind them lie deep, dark voids. And in one dream, you suddenly realize that you too are wearing a mask, the mask of the one who is always okay, always understanding, always staying. When you remove that mask, there is no immediate relief. What appears is not clarity, but a tired face marked by years of suppression. But there is one thing that makes you pause. In those eyes, there is light, not the light of innocence, but the light of someone who has walked through a long night. You wake with the feeling that you have touched something very deep, very difficult to name, but impossible to deny. That truth begins to spread into your waking life. You look back at what has happened, no longer entirely through the lens of self-blame. You see that you carried far too much that did not belong to you. You bore anger that was never acknowledged, shame that was denied, emptiness that the other person could not bear to face. And in that process, you traded away your own vitality. Realizing this does not immediately make you stronger, but it makes it impossible to keep pretending that everything is fine. This is the stage many mistake for weakness, when in truth it is a necessary form of disintegration. Your old identity, the one that believed your worth lay in endurance and rescue, is collapsing. You no longer have the strength to play the healer for others while you yourself are bleeding, and for the first time, instead of rushing to piece the fragments back together, you let them lie there, not because you have given up, but because you are beginning to understand that some things cannot be repaired by more sacrifice. The pain in this phase is no longer sharp, but dull and spreading. It comes with a sense of disorientation. If you are no longer the one who always stays, always carries, always understands others, then who are you? This question has no immediate answer, and the absence of an answer frightens you. Yet at the same time, it opens a rare space where something else can begin to form, even if you cannot yet see its shape. You realize that you once confused love with disappearance, connection with self-erasure, empathy with becoming a container for another person's darkness. This realization does not arrive as a clear lesson, but as a deep, quiet sadness. You grieve for your former self, the one who believed that being gentle enough would keep you chosen. And within that sadness, there is a softening, as if you are seeing yourself for the first time without judgment. From the outside, no one may notice what is happening. You still go to work, still talk, still fulfill responsibilities. But inside, a silent ritual is taking place, a ritual with no witnesses, no vows, only a bare confrontation with loss. Loss not only of a relationship, but of an old version of yourself. The version that believed endurance was strength, silence was love, pain was the price of belonging. And it is precisely at this lowest point, when you are no longer clinging to the old image, that something else begins to appear very softly. Not joy, not grand hope, but a very small and very real feeling. The sense that perhaps your breaking is not a sign of failure. Perhaps it is a sign that a structure no longer suitable is being dismantled. This thought is not strong enough to pull you out of pain, but it is strong enough to allow you to stay with it without destroying yourself. You still do not know who you will become after all of this. You only know that you cannot return to who you were before, and although that is frightening, it carries an honesty you have never allowed yourself before. Within that honesty, there is a fragile seed waiting, not to return to the past, but to become something else, something without a name yet, but slowly finding its voice in the silence. After that phase of disintegration, there is a period you cannot quite name. It is no longer sharp pain, but it is not peace either. Everything moves more slowly, more heavily, as if you are walking through a new space where gravity has changed. You are no longer pulled into emotional whirlwinds the way you once were, but you are not fully steady yet. What remains is a quiet vigilance, a feeling of staying awake even when you want to rest. You notice that you listen more carefully, observe more closely, and grow more cautious toward the things that once stirred you deeply. At times, you wonder if you are becoming cold. If this caution is the price you must pay for having trusted too easily before, you notice yourself pulling back from promises, slowing down before intimate gestures, and always keeping just enough distance so you are not swept away. But if you listen closely, you will realize this is not lifeless withdrawal. It is boundaries taking shape, something you were never allowed to have before, not because you did not know how, but because you never believed you had the right. In this phase, you begin to look back at what happened with a different kind of clarity. It is no longer only the question of what they did to you, but a deeper and more uncomfortable question. What within you allowed it all to continue? This question does not come to accuse. It arrives like a light shining into a room you have avoided for a long time. In that light, you see the fear of abandonment, the fear of not being enough, and a longing to be chosen that has lived inside you for as long as you can remember. You realize that you once felt most meaningful when you were needed, even when the cost was your own depletion. Seeing this is not pleasant. A subtle shame begins to surface, not because of what you endured, but because you are now seeing your hidden motivations more clearly. You once called it love, kindness, compassion, but now you see that beneath those things lived a very human desire to be important, to be kept, to not be forgotten. When this is seen, an old loop begins to lose its power. Not because you force yourself to change, but because you are no longer blind. At the same time, another fear appears. If you are no longer the one who always sacrifices, always carries, then what will you rely on to connect with others? You are used to love coming with pain. You are used to paying a price to stay. Now, when the idea of loving without disappearing begins to flicker, it feels both inviting and suspicious. A part of you does not believe it is real. Another part feels a very soft relief, as if your body has been waiting for that possibility for a long time. In new interactions, or even in old relationships, you begin to notice the difference. You listen without dissolving. You feel without immediately taking things on. When someone is sad, you can be there, but you no longer feel responsible for how they feel. This change is not loud, but it is deep. And sometimes, it makes you lonely. Because not everyone is comfortable with a version of you that is no longer easily shaped, no longer willing to carry what is not yours. There are moments when you miss your old softness, the quality that once made you lovable. You wonder if you are losing something beautiful. But then, in quiet moments, you realize that softness never disappeared. It is simply no longer placed in the hands of those who came to drain it. The gentleness is still there, but now it has boundaries, direction, and choice. You begin to understand that light does not need to shine everywhere to prove it exists. It is in this phase that something important happens. You stop trying to turn your experience into a story to explain to others. You no longer need to be fully understood or constantly validated that what you went through was real. Validation begins to come from within, from not dismissing small sensations, from allowing yourself to leave when something feels wrong, even when you cannot clearly justify it. This transformation does not make you invulnerable. You still have weak days, moments of doubt, times when old patterns knock on the door, but there is a fundamental difference. You no longer identify yourself with those moments. You no longer believe that every pain is a verdict on who you are. Instead, you begin to see them as signals, reminders, pieces of an inner map slowly revealing itself. From the outside, this journey may look very ordinary, There are no dramatic changes, no decisions that shock others. But inside, you are learning a new way of existing, a way of existing that does not depend on being needed, but on standing on your own. And even if you cannot yet name the person you are becoming, you begin to feel a strange and gentle stability. As if, after a long time living in someone else's house, you're finally laying the foundation for your own. There's a next phase that few people talk about. Because it does not look heroic or clearly healed, it unfolds when you're far enough away to no longer be pulled back, yet close enough to see everything very clearly. In this phase, the pain no longer comes from the narcissist outside, but from the collision with the deepest parts within you, parts you never had the space to look at directly before, because you were too busy surviving. You begin to realize that darkness does not exist only in the one who hurt you. It also exists, more subtly, within the structure of your own inner world, not as malice, but as a longing to be important, to be chosen, to be recognized at any cost. You see more clearly the part of you that once found meaning in sacrifice, that once felt valuable when needed, that was so afraid it was willing to stay in pain just to avoid being abandoned. Seeing this does not make you a bad person, but it makes it impossible to continue telling the old story of yourself as someone who was only a victim. This confrontation is very difficult because it removes your last refuge, the role of the pure victim. When you begin to see your part in the old loop, a subtle but deep shame appears, not shame for having been hurt, but for having traded yourself away to feel allowed to stay. But if you do not run from that feeling, if you are brave enough to stay with it, what comes next is not self-condemnation, but release. You understand that you did not choose pain, but you were familiar with it. You did not seek destruction, but you were conditioned to attach to structures that required constant effort to be worthy. When this truth is revealed, you no longer need to fight your past. You begin to see your entire journey as a series of adaptations to survive, rather than moral failures. And from that understanding, a new compassion arises, not directed outward first, but toward yourself. In this phase, you also begin to notice another danger. The danger of turning survival into identity. At times, you catch yourself retelling your suffering as a way to define who you are, as if without it you would be empty. But gradually, it begins to feel like it no longer fits. You do not want to live forever in the role of the one who endured. You do not want the past to remain the center of every choice. And that discomfort is a sign that you are moving out of survival and into becoming. You begin to feel more clearly the boundary between empathy and dissolution. When someone is in pain, you can still feel it, but you are no longer pulled under. You can be present without losing your center. There are moments when you recognize familiar behaviors, words carrying a faint scent of manipulation, but this time your body does not contract. You do not need long analysis. You simply step back. And in that stepping back, you feel a very new and very quiet strength, one that does not need to prove itself. In this phase, you also begin to have different dreams, no more images of being trapped, no more rooms without exits. Instead, there are scenes of descent and ascent, dark paths with light in the distance, mirrors reflecting you with eyes that are both tired and clear. These dreams explain nothing, but when you wake, you feel that something within you has been rearranged. You no longer rush to find answers to the question of who you will become. The question is still there, but it no longer creates panic. You begin to understand that some phases in life are not meant for definition, but for integration, for allowing opposing parts to coexist within you without excluding each other. Gentleness and fierceness, love and boundaries, empathy and self-sovereignty. You do not need to choose one and abandon the other. You learn to hold both. This can sometimes make you feel out of place, because when you no longer fully belong to the old role, but have not yet been named by the world in a new one, you stand in a very lonely in-between. Some relationships no longer fit. Some conversations become shallower, not because you are above anyone, but because you can no longer pretend not to see what you see. This loneliness is not comfortable, but it is clean. It no longer carries the feeling of abandonment, but feels like a necessary space to hear your own voice more clearly. You begin to live more slowly, not from fear, but because you are no longer driven by the need to prove your worth. You no longer rush into rescuing, fixing, and caring for others. When you help, it is because you choose to. When you love, it is because you want to. not because you are afraid of losing. This difference is subtle, but it changes the entire way you exist in the world. At this stage, you begin to sense a new kind of freedom, even if it is not complete yet. Freedom does not come from having every wound healed, but from no longer running from them. You can look back at the past without being pulled into it. You can think of the person from before without contracting or longing. They slowly become part of the story, no longer its center. And even if you have not named it yet, a truth is quietly forming within you. You are no longer someone who must carry another person's darkness to feel worthy. You also no longer need to deny your own darkness in order to be loved. Both of these truths are held at the same time, and the holding itself is the sign of an integration taking place, a step very close to wholeness, where the story is nearing its ending. There is a morning, or some very ordinary moment, when you suddenly realize that you have not thought about them for a long time, not through an effort to forget, not through controlling memory, but simply because your mind has made room for other things. That silence is not empty. It is calm, deep, and has a rhythm of its own. You realize that much of the pain that once defined you has stepped back, not completely gone, but no longer steering your life. You move through this world with a different feeling, no longer scanning other people's eyes to see if you are accepted, no longer adjusting your words to keep peace at any cost. You feel yourself fully present in your body, in each step, each small decision. There are moments when you still feel sad, still feel fragile, but those emotions move through you, rather than drowning you. You are no longer afraid of feeling, because you know you will not be consumed by your own emotions anymore. What changes most clearly is the way you see yourself. You no longer measure your worth by how much you give, how long you endure, or how needed you are by someone else. You no longer need a story to prove that you are worthy. You allow yourself to exist without apologizing for it. The voices outside, whether praise or criticism, slowly lose their old power. You hear them, but you no longer live inside them. You also no longer look at the past with bitterness. What happened is no longer evidence of weakness, but the trace of a journey. You see how deeply you once loved, how hard you once tried, and you do not need to deny that to become strong. Strength now is not about hardness, but about the ability to soften without breaking. You keep your compassion, but it no longer makes you disappear. There is a strange freedom that appears when you no longer need to be fully understood. You no longer explain so much. You no longer try to make others see you in a certain way. If someone understands, that is a gift. If not, you are still okay. This peace does not come from life becoming easy, but from no longer fighting yourself to stay in places that are no longer meant for you. You begin to realize that your light does not need to shine everywhere. It does not need to rescue. It does not need to prove itself. It only needs to exist in the right place. Some people will feel at ease around you because they do not need to wear a mask. Some people will feel uncomfortable because your presence reminds them of things they are not ready to face. You no longer try to please both. You let everything find its own place. In quiet moments, you can feel clearly that a reconciliation has taken place within. Parts that once conflicted no longer fight for control. Gentleness and boundaries coexist. Light and shadow are no longer enemies. You do not need to choose a side to be right. You are simply more whole than before. Not perfect, but real. And when you look back at the road you have walked, you no longer ask why this happened to you. That question has dissolved on its own. In its place is a very calm understanding without that collapse. You would not have met yourself in this way. Not the version that knows how to endure, but the version that knows how to stay with yourself. Not the version that lives to be chosen, but the version that knows how to choose. At this ending point, you no longer stand under the judgment of the world. You do not need to be called an empath, a survivor, or any other label. You are simply a human being who walked through darkness and did not lose yourself within it. A human being moving with your own rhythm, with inner stillness, with a sense of freedom that needs no declaration. And if there is one sentence that can say it all, it is this: I no longer live to be accepted. I live because I have returned to myself.
Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If this message touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss the next journey we take together. Your support means the world to me.